She heard the billionaire's betrayal minutes before the vows. Her contract twist shocked everyone. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We have noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It is quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support truly means everything to this channel. Let us keep growing together. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you so much. Now, let us return to our main character. 10 minutes before the wedding vows, she overheard him say, "End the contract after I do." But her pen was sharper than his empire. The rain hit the glass walls of the penthouse like a slow drumbeat. The city lights shimmered below, blurred by fog and distance. Inside, Evelyn Ross, 28, stood frozen in front of a sleek marble desk. Her hands trembled around the contract that could save her father's company or destroy her. Across from her, Julian Pierce, 35, billionaire CEO of Pierce Holdings, leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. He was the kind of man who filled a room even when he said nothing. His tie was perfectly knotted, his watch gleamed, and his tone was calm, too calm. "I need a wife on paper," he said. His voice was smooth but cold, like steel. 6 months. You get enough money to cover your debts and save your family business. I get to keep my position as CEO. It is just business, Miss Ross. Evelyn let out a shaky breath. "You are asking me to marry you. As a deal?" Julian nodded once. "Think of it as a contract. Nothing more." She stared down at the papers between them. Her father's hospital bills were stacked in her mind, unpaid and unrelenting. She had already sold her car, her jewelry, and most of her pride. Now the only thing left to sell was her time and maybe her heart. "What happens after 6 months?" she asked softly. "The contract ends," he replied, eyes never leaving hers. "You walk away with your freedom. I walk away with control of my company." Evelyn's voice cracked. "And if one of us breaks the terms, then the deal dissolves," he said. Completely. Silence filled the room, heavy as thunder. "And if one of us breaks the terms, one of us breaks the terms." Silence filled the room. The sound of rain grew louder, as if the sky itself was waiting for her answer. She picked up the pen, her fingers trembling. "Fine," she whispered. "But I am adding one more clause." Julian raised an eyebrow. "And what would that be?" Her pen pressed to paper, the ink bleeding slightly on the edge. "No lies. If one of us breaks trust, the entire contract becomes void." A faint smirk touched his lips. "Do you really believe in honesty, Miss Ross?" "I believe in consequences," she said, meeting his gaze. Julian signed the document with the ease of a man closing a business deal. When he pushed the pen toward her, his hand brushed hers steady, deliberate, electric. "Welcome to the arrangement," he said quietly. "Our wedding will be this Friday." Evelyn forced a nod, but as she turned toward the rain-streaked window, her reflection looked back half in light, half in shadow. The woman in the glass no longer looked like the dreamer who once designed buildings for people who could not afford them. She looked like someone who had just made a deal with a storm. Outside, the city thundered on, unaware that a marriage built on rules had just begun, and that one hidden sentence on page 4 would soon rewrite everything. The city was already awake when Evelyn arrived at her father's clinic the next morning. The smell of antiseptic and coffee filled the narrow hallway. She moved quietly, careful not to wake him. He had been asleep for hours, the oxygen machine beside him breathing in slow rhythm. She sat beside the bed, staring at the faint pulse on the monitor. The ring Julian had given her, a simple silver band for their contract, glinted on her finger. It felt too heavy for something so hollow. Her father stirred. "You look tired, sweetheart," he whispered. Evelyn forced a smile. "Just a long night at work, Dad, but things will get better soon, I promise." He nodded weakly, unaware of the papers she had signed to keep him in this bed. Her lie burned, but she held it anyway. Later that day, she stepped into the elevator of Pierce Holdings. The walls were lined with mirrors, reflecting versions of herself that looked nothing alike. The daughter, the designer, the soon-to-be fake wife. When the doors opened, Julian was already waiting in the lobby, crisp suit, unreadable eyes. "You are late," he said. "Traffic," she replied simply. Remember, Julian said, as they walked toward the press room. Our engagement dinner is tonight. The media will be there. You only need to smile, nod, and say yes. Evelyn kept her eyes forward. And what is nother wanand? About you? I will do the same, he said. Pretend well, Miss Ross. The world loves a perfect couple. The engagement dinner was everything she had feared. Bright lights, expensive wine, strangers with cameras pretending to care. Evelyn sat at a long table beside Julian, answering polite questions and laughing on cue. He played his role perfectly, the charming billionaire, the man who seemed to have it all. Only when the lights dimmed for the toast did she see something different. Julian raised his glass, his gaze meeting hers. For a second, his smile faltered, his voice softened. To new beginnings, he said. Evelyn hesitated, then echoed, to new beginnings. When the dinner ended, he offered his arm. Cameras flashed as they walked out together. But once the car door closed, silence fell between them. The city lights blurred past the window like streaks of gold and rain. Do you regret it? She asked quietly. Julian turned his head, his reflection, cutting through the glass. Regret requires emotion. I made a decision. Evelyn looked down at her hands. So did I. The car stopped outside her apartment. Before she could open the door, he spoke again. The world does not need to know it is fake, Evelyn. But you and I will remember every rule. No love, no lies, no expectations. She nodded, stepping out into the night air. Understood. As the car pulled away, she looked up at her building small, worn, barely standing against the skyline that his empire had built. She felt the wind against her face, cold and sharp, and thought about how easy it was for him to separate feelings from function. Inside her apartment, she hung up her coat and opened her sketchbook. Blueprints covered the pages buildings she had designed for low-income families, projects that had never been funded. Her dream was to build homes that felt like safety, not status. She touched the drawings gently, then the silver ring again. Maybe, she thought, every structure, like every relationship, needs pressure to prove what it is made of. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Tomorrow would bring fittings, rehearsals, and another layer of pretending. But tonight, as she watched the rain trace lines down her window, Evelyn Ross whispered to herself the one truth she could still afford to keep. I may have signed a contract, she said softly, but I have not sold my soul. 3 days later, the penthouse was filled with stylists, planners, and assistants moving like an army before a battle. Evelyn stood in front of a mirror while a makeup artist brushed foundation over her pale skin. Her reflection looked like a stranger wrapped in silk and expectations. Julian's assistant, a sharp woman named Claire, handed her a stack of folders. Your schedule for the week, Miss Ross. Dress rehearsal tonight, media interview tomorrow morning, and the final ceremony walkthrough on Friday. Mr. Pierce wants everything. Precise. Evelyn nodded, keeping her tone polite. Of course. When Claire left, she looked at her reflection again. The silver band still rested on her finger. It felt colder than ever. The rehearsal dinner took place at a private hall overlooking the Hudson River. Chandeliers shimmered above like captured stars. Julian arrived late, as always, his presence commanding attention the moment he entered. Conversations quieted. Every flash of the camera turned toward him. He walked straight to her, offering his hand. Shall we give them the performance they came for? Evelyn smiled faintly, placing her hand in his. I suppose we should. As they stepped onto the stage, a soft melody filled the room. They practiced walking down the aisle, their steps synchronized but hearts detached. The photographer captured every angle, and yet the only thing real in the room was the sound of Evelyn's heartbeat in her ears. During a short break, she stepped out onto the balcony for air. The city below was alive with light. The cold wind tangled her hair as she leaned against the railing. That was when Julian joined her. His tie loosened. The edge of his composure softened. You did well, he said quietly. She looked at him. I practiced being perfect. He studied her face. You are a quick learner. There was something different in his tone, less control, more curiosity. For the first time, she wondered what he sounded like when he was not performing for the world. Why do you need this so badly, Julian? She asked. You could have chosen anyone. Why me? His jaw tightened. Because you do not want anything from me. That makes you safe. Evelyn exhaled, the words cutting sharper than she expected. Safe is another word for forgettable. He turned to face her fully. That is not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Julian looked away, his eyes on the skyline. This company was built on control. If I lose it, thousands lose their jobs. I do what I must. Evelyn's voice softened. And what happens when control costs you everything human about yourself? He did not answer. The air between them thickened with things unsaid. Later that night, when she returned to her apartment, she found a small envelope slipped under the door. Inside was a folded note written in neat handwriting. Remember, Clause 4, no lies. There was no signature, but she recognized Julian's penmanship. For a long moment, she stared at the note, unsure if it was a warning or an acknowledgement. Then she placed it inside her sketchbook, between two unfinished designs. That night, sleep would not come easily. The city hummed below her window, restless and indifferent. She thought about the upcoming wedding, about cameras and contracts, about the moment the vows would seal what neither of them truly wanted. Yet somewhere inside her, a small voice whispered that the truth has a way of finding its own stage. When dawn broke, Evelyn stood by the window, watching the first light touch the skyline. In a few days, she would walk down an aisle built on lies. But for now, she had work to do, lines to draw, and one quiet promise to keep. If the contract was destined to end in betrayal, she would make sure the ending belonged to her. The morning of the interview arrived with the gray light of an overcast sky. Evelyn sat in the back seat of a black sedan, her heart thudding beneath the satin of her dress. The city rolled past in flashes of glass and steel, the kind of skyline that belonged to Julian Pierce. She glanced at her reflection in the car window. The woman staring back looked confident, poised, almost untouchable. But her hands, hidden in her lap, were clenched tight. At Pierce Holdings, reporters filled the marble lobby. The interview would be broadcast live, meant to present Julian and Evelyn as a power couple before the wedding. As she stepped out, camera lights burst like fireworks. Julian was already there, shaking hands, smiling as if the world adored him. When he turned to her, his expression softened just enough for the cameras to believe it. He whispered without moving his lips, "Just stay calm. Remember your lines." Evelyn nodded, her voice steady. "I remember." They sat side by side on a cream sofa beneath the company's logo. The host, a woman with practiced warmth, smiled into the camera. "Mr. Pierce, Miss Ross, the world has been fascinated by your whirlwind romance. Tell us, how did it begin?" Julian answered smoothly. "Sometimes fate works faster than logic. We met at a charity event, and I knew immediately that she was the one." The audience laughed softly. Evelyn kept her smile, though her stomach turned. Every word was a script, every gesture rehearsed. When the host turned to her, she forced herself to breathe. "Julian taught me that strength is not about wealth," she said. "It is about keeping your word." Julian's eyes flickered at that, a brief shadow of surprise. The camera light caught his face, and for once, he looked unsure. After the interview ended, the cameras shut off, and the room emptied. Julian remained silent until they were alone. Then he said quietly, "That was not in the script." Evelyn looked up at him. "Neither is life." He stared at her for a long moment before walking away, his footsteps echoing through the empty hall. That evening, the stylists returned for the final fitting. The gown was flawless, a cascade of ivory silk that shimmered in the dim light. Evelyn stood still as pins were adjusted, her mind drifting to the note he had left her. Remember, Clause 4, no lies. As the team packed up, she reached for her phone and saw a notification from an unknown number. A text blinked on the screen. "If you want the truth, meet me at the rooftop. Now." Her pulse quickened. She slipped on her coat and took the private elevator to the top floor. The wind hit her face as the doors opened, sharp and cold. Julian was already there, his tie undone, his hair tousled by the wind. "I thought you did not believe in surprises," she said. He turned toward her, something heavy in his eyes. "I do not, but I needed to see you without an audience." The city glowed below them, endless and bright. For a moment, neither spoke. "I saw the way you looked at me today," he said finally. "You do not trust me." Evelyn crossed her arms. "Should I?" He hesitated. "I do not expect you to, but I want you to know, The contract was never about the money for me. She blinked. Then what was it? Julian's gaze fell to the ground. It was about control. My board wanted me to marry for appearance. I chose someone who did not care about my name. I thought that would keep me safe. But somehow, you have become the only part of this that feels real. Evelyn's breath caught. And yet you still treat it like business. He stepped closer. Because business is the only language I know. The silence between them hummed with electricity, fragile and alive. For a fleeting second, she saw the man behind the empire, the one who carried more fear than pride. Evelyn turned away, her voice barely above a whisper. Then learn a new language, Julian. Because contracts end, but people remember the truth. She left him standing there as the wind howled through the city. Far below, the lights flickered like witnesses, waiting for the day those words would come back to test them both. The next night came with the sound of rain again, the same rhythm that had started everything. Evelyn stood in front of the mirror, her wedding gown hanging nearby like a promise she could no longer trust. The ceremony was less than 24 hours away. The world believed she was marrying for love, but only she knew the truth that love had been written out of the contract from the beginning. Her phone buzzed on the basing faux. Vanity. It was a message from Claire, Julian's assistant. Final rehearsal tomorrow at 11. Press conference at noon. Do not be late. Evelyn typed back a simple "understood" before putting the phone down. She sat still for a moment, staring at the silver band on her finger. It reflected the faint light from the window, a reminder that what glittered was not always gold. That same evening, Julian was hosting a late meeting with the board. The walls of the conference room gleamed with glass and power. The directors congratulated him on the upcoming wedding, calling it a strategic move that stabilized investor confidence. Julian nodded mechanically, though his mind was somewhere else. When the meeting ended, one of the board members leaned closer. After the vows, you can quietly terminate the agreement. The media will forget in a month. The company will belong to you again. Julian did not respond, but he did not correct the man either. That silence was a choice one that would echo later. The next morning, Evelyn arrived at the chapel for the final walkthrough. Everything was perfect, the aisle lined with white lilies, the seats draped in silver ribbons, the grand chandelier shining above. Photographers buzzed around, preparing for the big day. She walked slowly down the aisle, each step heavier than the last. When the coordinator called for a break, she stepped into a quiet corridor, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. She turned the corner and froze. Julian's voice came from the next room, low but unmistakable. Once the ceremony ends, end the contract. She will not fight it. Her chest tightened. A man's voice replied, "Are you sure?" She seems smarter than she looks. Julian's tone was flat. She will take the money and leave. They always do. The words hit harder than she expected. For a moment, she could not breathe. Her heart pounded so loud that she feared they would hear it. Then she turned away, walking back down the hall, every step measured, her face calm even as her soul cracked open. Back in her dressing room, she shut the door and stood there in silence. The rain outside had started again, faint against the glass, steady and unrelenting. She took a long breath, wiped her tears, and sat at the small writing desk in the corner. The contract lay inside her folder, the ink of their signatures dark and cold. She read the lines again, slowly, carefully, until she reached the one clause she had written herself. No lies. If one of us breaks trust, the entire contract becomes void. Her hands steadied. She reached for her pen and opened her laptop. A new document blinked on the screen. Contract amendment. The cursor waited for her words. She began to type, her voice steady as the rain outside. Clause 4. In the event of deception prior to the marriage vows, the controlling interest of Pierce Holdings will transfer to the Grant Hope Foundation, effective immediately upon breach. She printed the page, slipped it into the folder, and sealed it with the same pen Julian had once used to sign their deal. When she looked up, her reflection in the mirror was different. Her eyes no longer trembled. She did not see the desperate woman who had signed out of fear. She saw someone who had learned how to fight with grace. Tomorrow, the cameras would capture a perfect wedding. The world would see white flowers and diamond smiles. But behind the veil, Evelyn Ross would be carrying something far sharper than heartbreak, a pen, a contract, and the quiet certainty that this time she would write the ending herself. The morning of the wedding arrived beneath a heavy sky. The clouds hung low over Manhattan, and the city felt slower, quieter, as if even the wind was holding its breath. Inside the Grand Astoria Hotel, the top floor had been transformed into a palace of white and silver. Strings of lights shimmered across crystal chandeliers. Rows of reporters stood waiting for the ceremony of the year Julian Pierce's marriage to Evelyn Ross. Behind the closed doors of her dressing suite, Evelyn sat in front of the mirror, the veil resting beside her like a ghost of the woman she used to be. Her makeup artist had just left, and for a moment, the world was still. The amended contract sat folded inside her clutch, the ink of her signature still fresh. Claire entered quietly. "The ceremony begins in 15 minutes, Miss Ross. Mr. Pierce is already in position." Evelyn nodded, her voice calm. "Thank you, Claire. I will be there soon." When she was alone again, she reached for the silver ring, Julian's symbolic promise. She rolled it between her fingers, then slipped it onto her hand. "Let us finish what we started," she whispered to her reflection. Downstairs, Julian waited at the altar, surrounded by cameras and board members dressed like witnesses to a royal event. He looked composed, even serene, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Every seat was filled, every lens pointed at him, and yet the only thing that mattered was the sound of her footsteps approaching. When the doors opened, the crowd rose to their feet. Evelyn appeared at the top of the grand staircase, her gown trailing like liquid light. For a moment, time paused. She walked slowly, each step deliberate, her eyes locked on his. Julian's chest tightened, an unfamiliar H pressing against the armor of his control. As she reached him, he whispered, "You look breathtaking." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Thank you. I am sure the photos will look perfect." The officiant began to speak, the words echoing through the hall. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls." Cameras flashed. The audience leaned in. The city outside continued to hum, unaware of what was about to unfold. When the time came for vows, Julian turned to her. His voice was low, confident. "Evelyn, from the moment I met you." But she raised a hand gently, interrupting him. "Before we continue, I have something to add." The crowd murmured. The officiant looked confused. Evelyn reached into her clutch and handed a folded document to the event coordinator. "This," she said clearly, "is a small amendment to our contract. For transparency, I would like it read aloud before we exchange vows." Julian's brow furrowed. "Evelyn, what are you doing?" She met his gaze, steady and unafraid. "Honoring Clause 4, no lies." The coordinator unfolded the paper and read the words that silenced the entire hall. Clause 4. In the event of deception prior to the marriage vows, the controlling interest of Pierce Holdings will transfer to the Grant Hope Foundation, effective immediately upon breach. Gasps filled the room. The board members exchanged shocked looks. The reporters surged forward, flashes exploding like lightning. Julian froze, his heartbeat roaring in his ears. Evelyn looked at him gently. "You taught me that business is about control, but I learned something else. Real power comes from telling the truth." For a moment, the entire room held still. Then the murmurs began, reporters whispering, phones buzzing with live updates. Julian's jaw clenched, but he did not speak. He simply looked at her, the woman who had just rewritten his future with grace and precision. The officiant cleared his throat nervously. "Shall we continue?" Evelyn gave a small nod. "No, I believe the contract has already spoken for us." She turned, her gown sweeping the marble floor as she walked away from the altar. The cameras followed her every step. Behind her, Julian stood motionless, surrounded by everything he had built, and suddenly realizing what he had just lost. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall again, tapping softly against the tall windows of the Grand Astoria. Evelyn lifted her face to the sky, letting the rain wash away the last trace of fear. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew that for once, her choices were her own. The deepest secrets are about to change everything. Subscribe now to catch the dramatic twist that is coming in the next chapter. The news broke before the ceremony lights had even dimmed. By the time Evelyn reached the hotel entrance, Headlines were already flashing across phone screens and digital billboards. The billionaire bride's claws shocks Wall Street. Reporters swarmed the driveway, shouting questions, cameras flashing like a storm. She kept walking, her heels steady against the marble, her chin lifted high. In a quiet corner of the hotel garage, her driver opened the car door. "Miss Ross, are you all right?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "For the first time, I think I am." The car door shut, sealing out the chaos. As they pulled into the rain-slicked streets, she looked out at the city lights. Somewhere behind her, Julian Pierce's empire was trembling. Inside the Grand Astoria, Julian stood frozen at the altar. The guests had begun to disperse, murmuring in disbelief. His board members surrounded him, demanding answers. The cameras still rolled, feeding the story to every network in the country. "Julian, what does this mean?" one of them barked. "It means," Julian said quietly, "that I underestimated her." He walked out of the ballroom without another word, ignoring the questions, the flashes, and the whispers. The elevator doors closed behind him, and for the first time in years, he allowed the silence to settle. Hours later, alone in his office, Julian poured himself a drink he could barely taste. The city skyline stretched before him, vast and untouchable. He stared at the reflection of his own face in the window, sharp, tired, unfamiliar. The contract folder lay open on his desk, the amended page staring back at him like a mirror of his own arrogance. He replayed her words in his mind. Real power comes from telling the truth. He had spent his life building walls of control, mistaking fear for strength. But tonight, a single act of honesty had undone everything he thought was unshakable. Julian set the glass down and reached for his phone. He scrolled through the endless news alerts, the trending tags, the opinion pieces calling him out for deceit and manipulation. Yet among the noise, one headline stopped him cold. "Pierce Holdings stock rises after bride, redirects ownership to charity." He read it twice. The foundation she named the Grant Hope Foundation was already receiving donations. Public sentiment had shifted overnight. For the first time, his company was being praised not for its power, but for its potential to do good. Julian leaned back, a slow exhale escaping him. He had lost everything he thought mattered, yet somehow, the world had become better for it. Outside, dawn began to touch the horizon. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets shining with light. He glanced once more at the signed contract, the final proof of his defeat and her victory. Then, without a word, he reached for his coat. It was time to find Evelyn Ross. 2 days later, the city had already moved on to its next scandal, but the name Evelyn Ross still lingered on every headline. She had not given interviews or made statements. Instead, she had quietly vanished from the spotlight. That morning, she stood outside a construction site on the east side, the wind catching the loose strands of her hair. The sign above the gate read, "Grant Hope Foundation, Community Housing Project." Workers moved in rhythm, pouring concrete, measuring beams, building something that actually mattered. Evelyn smiled faintly. This was what she had dreamed of: real homes for real people, not glass towers for profit. Behind her, a familiar voice broke the silence. "You have a talent for disappearing." She turned, her breath catching for just a second. Julian stood a few feet away, raincoat still damp from the drizzle, eyes tired but softer than she remembered. "I did not disappear," she said quietly. "I just went somewhere honest." He gave a small nod. "You did more than that. You rebuilt my company's soul in 48 hours. Investors are calling this the most ethical turnaround in a decade." Evelyn looked at him, uncertain whether to laugh or cry. "That was not my intention. I only wanted the truth to stand." Julian stepped closer, his voice lower now. "You gave the world something I never could trust." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of machinery filled the gap between their words. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "I came here because I needed to say something." Evelyn folded her arms, cautious. "I am listening." He drew a slow breath. "You were right. I built everything out of fear of losing control, of losing people, of being seen as weak. But when you walked away, I realized something worse. Control is nothing without conscience." Her expression softened. "Julian." He shook his head gently. "You do not have to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I dissolved the board's control and donated my remaining shares to the foundation. It belongs to the people now. I am starting over. Evelyn blinked, stunned. You really did that? He smiled faintly. For once, it felt right to lose something for the right reason. A long pause settled between them, filled with the scent of rain and new cement. Evelyn stepped closer, her tone steady. Maybe losing was never the point. Maybe this was the only way to start again. Julian met her gaze, his voice barely a whisper. Then let me start here with you. The air between them stilled, the noise of the city fading away. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, then smiled softly, not with triumph, but with peace. Behind them, workers continued building the foundation's first home. It rose beam by beam, steady and true, just like something new between them, something real at last. A full year passed before the city heard the name Evelyn Ross again. This time, it was not on scandal headlines, but on a bronze plaque unveiled in the heart of the East Side. The morning sun glowed softly across the crowd gathered for the grand opening of the Pierce Community Complex, a network of homes and art spaces built entirely through the Grant Hope Foundation. Evelyn stood at the podium in a cream suit, her voice calm but filled with quiet pride. This building is not about wealth or power. It is about giving people the chance to belong somewhere. We built this with truth, not contracts, with hope, not fear. The audience applauded warmly. Cameras clicked, but this time the attention did not feel like a cage. She caught sight of Julian in the crowd. He stood near the back, hands in his pockets, wearing a simple gray jacket instead of his usual tailored armor. When their eyes met, he smiled a real smile, small and unguarded. After the ceremony, he approached her. "It looks perfect," he said softly. "You did it." Evelyn shook her head. "We did it. You kept your promise." He glanced at the engraved plaque, reading the words aloud. "Dedicated to those who choose integrity over control and love over fear." "That sounds like something you would write," she smiled. "You helped me believe it." They walked along the garden path beside the building, passing murals painted by local artists and children from the community. Julian stopped near the fountain, where the water reflected the morning light. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I know we never finished what we started," he said, his voice almost trembling. "But maybe we can start something new without contracts this time." Evelyn opened the box. Inside was a simple gold ring, delicate and unpolished, nothing like the one from their staged ceremony. She looked up at him, her eyes warm. "No cameras, no signatures." "No," he said, "just a promise." The wind brushed through her hair as she took his hand. "Then I promise too." They exchanged the ring under the open sky. No witnesses except the sound of laughter from the courtyard and the rhythm of a city finally at peace. Later that day, a young volunteer walked through the lobby carrying a framed document, the old contract between Julian and Evelyn. It was displayed inside a glass case beside the entrance. Across the top, in bold letters, the final line remained visible. Clause 4, no lies. Underneath, a small gold plate bore a single inscription, the contract that built the truth. Evelyn paused by the display before leaving, her hand resting gently on the glass. She smiled to herself, whispering, "We burned the paper, but we kept the vow." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, pouring golden light across the new homes. It was not the end of their story, just a different beginning, one written in honesty and built to last. Thank you for joining us for this cinematic adventure. If you want more untold stories of billionaire love and redemption, please subscribe and choose your next true heart journey on your screen now.